If I could go back to one moment and rip it from the timeline, it'd be that Friday morning when I dropped Grace off at my parents' house. That moment right there, that was the fork in the road where everything started to unravel. It wasn't a big deal at the time. I had a last-minute work trip, Alina had a client emergency, and we figured, hey, one weekend with her grandparents wouldn't kill her. They'd raised me after all. Strict, sure. A little too obsessed with appearances, maybe. But they'd never harmed a soul, or so I thought. Grace was 8, bright, wild-haired, always asking impossible questions. She clutched her stuffed tiger as we stood in my parents' marble foyer. My mother gave her that brittle smile she reserved for photos and charity events. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. And my brother Daniel, well, he was just there for the optics, like always. Be good for Grandpa and Grandma, I told Grace, kneeling to her level. We'll call tonight, okay? She nodded, but she held on to my hand a second longer than usual. That should have told me something. When I kissed her goodbye and drove off, I didn't feel relief. I felt off, like I'd left her in a museum, not a home. But I pushed that feeling down, just like I'd done my whole life when it came to my family. You learn not to question things when questioning them gets you labeled difficult. The call came Saturday night. My mother's voice was clipped. Grace fell. Scraped her knee. Nothing serious. No details. No emotion. I called Grace immediately. No answer. When I asked to speak to her, my mother said she's resting. We'll call in the morning. They didn't. And by the time we saw her Sunday evening, Grace was pale, limping, and barely speaking. I touched her leg. She winced and pulled away. Something was very, very wrong. I should have driven straight to the ER. But instead, I stood in my parents' pristine living room holding my daughter's shaking hand while my mother insisted it was just a little bruise. She's always been dramatic, she said, sipping from her crystal glass like we were discussing whether, not a child in pain. Alina was already kneeling, gently pressing Grace's ankle. This isn't a bruise, she said, her voice tight. This is swelling. She needs an X-ray. Now. My father scoffed. Let's not overreact. You'll scare her. Scare her? She was already scared, eyes glassy, body tense, flinching at every move. But it wasn't until Daniel opened his mouth that I felt the first crack in something I hadn't realized was even breakable. She tripped, he said. We were getting ready for the fundraiser dinner. She said her leg hurt, but we couldn't just cancel. He said it like it was a perfectly reasonable trade, dinner and donors over an 8-year-old's scream. Alina stood up slowly. So you left her here, injured, 4 hours? She was resting, my mother said, with the same cold efficiency she used to schedule Botox appointments. My daughter was resting on a fractured tibia. That's what the ER would tell us 3 hours later. And during that entire drive to the hospital, Grace stayed silent. Not a whimper, not a tear. Just silence. That silence? It said more than 1,000 screams. It said, I learned today how much I matter to them. And for the first time, I didn't defend them. For the first time, I looked at my own bloodline and felt shame. The X-ray was clear as day, a clean break, midshaft tibia. The kind of injury that would make a grown man curse out loud. Grace? She bit her lip and said nothing. The doctor looked at us like we were monsters. How long ago did this happen? He asked. I looked at the floor. Alina answered. Over 24 hours ago. His face hardened. You should have brought her in immediately. She wasn't with us, she said quietly. She was with family. He didn't say anything after that. He didn't need to. Grace was fitted with a cast. They gave her something for the pain. She finally slept. And that's when Alina looked at me and said something I'll never forget. I'm done protecting your parents' reputation. I'm done pretending they care about her. I nodded. Not because I agreed, I wasn't even sure what I felt yet, but because she was right. I'd been the quiet son, the obedient one. The one who didn't ask for too much, who showed up in a pressed shirt and didn't rock the boat. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about the 8-year-old who had learned that breaking her leg mattered less than my parents' dinner plans. Back at home, we laid Grace in her bed and closed the door gently behind us. Then Alina did something else I'd never seen her do. She opened her laptop and started typing. What are you doing? I asked. Filing a report, she said. And drafting a legal document. From now on, they get nothing, not a visit, not a photo, not a whisper of access. Her voice didn't shake. Her fingers didn't pause. And just like that, the line was drawn. They didn't know it yet, but my family had just lost the one thing they'd always assumed was theirs. Access. The first letter was clean, professional, and airtight. Certified. Return receipt requested. No room for misunderstanding. It went to my parents, laying out what had happened, the timeline of events, and the medical records to prove it. Alina didn't ask for an apology. She didn't invite discussion. She laid down the law. All contact with Grace was now legally prohibited. The second letter went to my brother Daniel. Shorter but sharper. You let her walk on a broken leg because your suit was pressed and your name was on a seating chart, it read. Your Ivy League diploma won't cover that. I watched her seal the envelope, her face calm, too calm. That night, I found her on the back porch, staring into the dark. They always had a version of us in their heads, she said. And Grace never fit into it. I didn't argue, because deep down, I knew she was right. The fallout came quickly. Phone calls, voicemails, emails dripping with justifications. It was a misunderstanding. She didn't tell us how much pain she was in. You're overreacting. We didn't respond. Then came the letters. Long, rambling things, pages of emotional blackmail dressed up as family concern. They showed up every week, addressed to Grace. We never opened them. Eventually, Grace asked if she had to read them. We told her the truth. No, you don't owe them anything. She nodded, then dropped the unopened envelope into the trash herself. That was the moment the karma started rolling downhill. Not with screaming or accusations, but with silence. The kind of silence that chokes. The kind they couldn't manipulate. The silence didn't stay private for long. Word started leaking out, first through whispers at Grace's school, then sideways glances at Sunday market. Parents talk. Coaches talk. And when Aunt Eleanor decided she'd had enough of watching from the sidelines, well, that's when the dam broke. Eleanor wasn't loud. She didn't rant. She just told the truth quietly, clearly, and to exactly the right people. What happened to Grace? The injury. The delay. The dinner party. All of it. The story spread like wildfire, only this time no one was rushing to offer sympathy to my family. That year, my mother's annual charity brunch was mysteriously underattended. Daniel's bid for a board seat at the hospital went unreturned. And my father? The man who'd spent decades building a legacy on polished smiles and expensive handshakes, he started getting declined for the very invitations he used to send. Because the thing about image is, once it cracks, people see what was always underneath. They tried to change the narrative, of course. We didn't know it was broken. She didn't tell us. They're blowing it out of proportion. But no one bought it. Not after Eleanor spoke. Not after Alina released a brief, fact-only statement through her lawyer that simply ended with, "We are choosing peace and protection for our daughter." Nothing more. No drama. No revenge. Just cold, public clarity. And that was the beginning of the end for them. Not because we fought back, but because we didn't have to. The next attempt was subtle. A call to Grace's school counselor. An email to her soccer coach. A request framed politely to check in on her, just to make sure she was okay. They didn't mention the letters, or the injury, or the restraining order filed so cleanly it may as well have been surgical. But the intent was clear: if they couldn't reach Grace through us, they'd go around us. It backfired instantly. The school flagged the contact. The coach forwarded the email straight to our attorney. And just like that, we had another line added to the cease and desist. Another layer of documentation. Another brick in the wall. Control, that thing my parents had gripped with white knuckles their entire lives, was finally gone. And not with screaming matches or door-slamming drama. No, it was the cold rejection that stung the most. They were used to being feared, respected, obeyed. But now, they were being ignored. Alina never even raised her voice. She didn't have to. She sent one final letter, just one, and it ended with a single sentence. "This family is no longer accessible to you in any form." It wasn't loud, but it landed harder than any confrontation ever could. That was the karma. Not scandal. Not jail time. Just quiet, calculated exclusion. And worst of all, it came from the granddaughter they thought they owned. I knew the letters were still coming, one every week, like clockwork. They came scented with my mother's perfume, with Daniel's expensive stationery, with desperate handwriting dressed up as dignity. Long-winded apologies, memories rewritten, flattery they never would have offered when it counted. Grace didn't open a single one, not even out of curiosity. She'd take them from the mailbox, hand them to me or Alina, and walk away. No anger, no ceremony, just quiet dismissal. One afternoon, she said, "If they didn't listen when I was hurt, why would I care what they say now?" And that was it. No need for therapy jargon or forced forgiveness. She'd made her choice. Not because we told her to, but because their betrayal was loud enough for an 8-year-old to hear all on her own. That's what they never saw coming. Not the legal blocks. Not the reputational damage. But the simple fact that Grace, the brightest soul in the room, didn't need convincing. She looked at their absence, remembered the pain, and decided. Never again. They tried everything after that, sending gifts, donations made in her name, even an open letter published in the alumni newsletter where my father once sat on the board. But nothing changed. They were officially ghosts. And Grace? She was done being haunted. Grace's school had its annual spring showcase, a big deal in our town. Performances, awards, speeches from kids who'd grown taller than their parents remembered. She'd been practicing for weeks. Her part? A spoken word piece about courage. The kind of thing that would have made my mother cry if she'd been allowed within 50 feet of the auditorium. But she wasn't. We made sure of that. The principal was fully briefed. Security had names, photos, legal paperwork in hand. Alina had checked every exit. Me? I watched the parking lot from the back row just in case someone thought nostalgia was a valid excuse for trespassing. They didn't show. Maybe they finally understood. Or maybe they just couldn't stand the idea of being seen and not welcomed. Either way, they missed it. They missed Grace standing center stage, cast-free now but stronger in ways they'd never understand. They missed the way her classmates cheered, the way her teacher teared up, and they missed what she said at the end. She looked straight into the crowd, her voice steady and clear. Courage isn't about doing something dangerous. It's about choosing to walk away when people who are supposed to love you don't. You could have heard a pin drop. And me? I didn't cry. But Alina did. Just once. Quietly. Because that was the moment we realized Grace hadn't just survived what they did. She transformed because of it. You'd think people like my parents would know when to quit. But narcissism has a way of dressing delusion in confidence. When they couldn't reach Grace directly, they started working the periphery. Old friends, distant cousins, even the football coach from Grace's summer league, they tried them all. One by one, those people came to us. Your father left me a voicemail. Sounded desperate. Your brother emailed me asking if I'd put in a good word. For what? The coach said he got a message from a woman claiming to be Grace's guardian figure. Said she needed updates on her emotional state. That one nearly made Alina laugh. The irony? My parents had spent their whole lives curating this image of power and polish. But when push came to shove, they showed their hand, begging, bribing, and bluffing their way back into relevance. It didn't work. Every attempt they made just added more documentation. More proof of boundary violations. More weight for the court if it came to that again. But the worst part for them? People didn't believe them anymore. They tried to spin a new version of events, that Grace was confused, that Alina had overreacted, that I was being manipulated. But that narrative collapsed fast. Because no one believed the people who ignored a child in pain. Especially after Eleanor gave a radio interview about family image versus family integrity. She never named names, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew. And just like that, my parents' empire of appearances crumbled. No one was picking up their calls anymore. There was one last card they tried to play: nostalgia. They sent a framed photo of Grace from when she was 3. A duplicate of one we'd taken on a beach trip long before any of this ugliness started. On the back, a note in my mother's handwriting: we miss her laughter. We miss our family. Grace saw it in the mailbox. She didn't even blink. Do you want me to toss it? I asked. No, she said, but I don't want it in the house either. We walked out back together. She took the frame, opened the glass, removed the photo, and then ripped it straight down the middle. Not in anger. Not to make a statement. Just because she could. I don't miss them, she said. I just miss who I thought they were. That's when I realized this wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about truth. Grace had faced something most adults struggle with: realizing the people who claim to love you can still cause harm. And she'd chosen clarity over comfort. Truth over fantasy. Alina stood by the kitchen window, watching us. When we came back in, she didn't say a word. Just pulled Grace into a hug and held her there. My wife didn't need revenge. She had the truth. And she had the only justice that really mattered. Grace was safe. And my family? They'd never get the chance to hurt her again. After the photo, they went quiet. No letters. No voicemails. Just radio silence. It wasn't peace, they were regrouping. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a new envelope. Not handwritten. Not emotional. Legal. Inside, a request for mediated visitation. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a tidy bullet point list of conditions for how and when they'd like to see Grace again, as if this were some corporate negotiation. Alina laughed when she read it. A bitter, tired laugh. They still think this is about logistics, she said. They think if they present it right, we'll fold. She didn't even wait to reply. She contacted our attorney, who filed a formal response that made the message clear: not only would visitation be denied, but any future attempts to coerce, manipulate, or bypass legal boundaries would trigger escalation. Our lawyer attached transcripts, documentation, every ignored call, every denied boundary, every attempt to rewrite history. We made it airtight, but the finishing touch was a personal letter, Alina's, not mine. One they didn't expect. In it, she wrote, "You had control for decades. Over your image, your reputation, your family. You lost that the day you chose silence over Grace's screams. That control is gone. Permanently. They'd spent their lives building influence, pulling strings, crafting perceptions. And now? They couldn't even get past the front office of a middle school. Fall rolled in with sharp air and brighter skies, Grace's favorite season. She made the student council. Got cast as the lead in the winter play. Started soccer again, hobbling out with that cast-free leg like it had never been broken. But we remembered. Every step she took was a reminder of what it had cost to get here. There was a game in late October. Championship level. The kind of event that used to have my father showing up with a camera crew and my mother handing out custom-printed water bottles. But this year, the 2 chairs they used to sit in stayed empty. Grace saw them. Didn't flinch. She glanced over once, gave a little nod to no one in particular, and went back to warming up. Alina squeezed my hand. That was the moment we realized this wasn't just about cutting them off. This was about replacing them with silence, with peace, with people who actually show up. Her coach never asked why the grandparents disappeared. Neither did her teammates. And when Grace scored the final goal, the only people who ran to her were the ones who mattered. Later that night, a friend of my brother's texted me a photo. It was of my parents, sitting alone at some event, far from the field, faces drawn tight, staring at a phone like they were waiting for someone to call. No one did. That was karma. Not explosive. Just undeniable. Thanksgiving came with its usual noise, laughter from the kitchen, cousins on the lawn, Grace helping Alina mash potatoes with more butter than should be legal. That's when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a delivery envelope. No note this time. Just a packet of documents. Another letter. This one was different. It wasn't legal. It wasn't angry. It was desperate. They were offering trust funds. Apologies. Stories of their own childhood pain, thin attempts at rewriting their narrative, hoping if they bared just enough vulnerability, we'd let them back in. They even included a photo album. Pages of Grace from birthdays and holidays they'd attended, now captioned in shaky handwriting. As if curating memory could erase reality. We didn't show Grace the letter. Not yet. She was too busy living the life they forfeited. But I read one line out loud to Alina. She'll want to know where she came from. Alina didn't blink. She already knows, she said. She came from love. From survival. From choosing better. Then she took the album, walked out to the fire pit, and dropped it in. We stood together as the pages curled and blackened, the faces that once held power fading to ash. That was the last attempt. They hadn't just lost access. They'd lost relevance. It was Grace's 12th birthday when the final blow landed, not from us, not from the court, but from Grace herself. She sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by friends, a cake Alina baked from scratch, and laughter that filled every inch of our home. No trace of limping. No shadow of what came before. When the last gift was opened and the last candle blown out, she turned to us and said, "I think I'm ready." We knew what she meant. She wanted to see the letters. The ones we kept locked in a drawer. Not because we were hiding anything, but because she needed to be the one to choose when. She read through 5 years of desperate apologies, reworded justifications, and guilt-wrapped in ribbon. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just looked up and said, "They've never written me a single sentence that wasn't about them." And then she did something none of us expected. She pulled out a piece of paper and wrote her own letter. 3 lines. "I am not angry. I am not confused. I am just not interested." She folded it, placed it into a fresh envelope, and asked me to drop it in the mailbox. She never asked if they'd respond. Because she didn't care. They had lost the war they didn't even know they were fighting, the war for her trust, her love, her memory. And that was the end of their legacy. I saw my parents once after that. Briefly. From a distance. It was at the courthouse, family estate matters, nothing dramatic. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in presence. Like the weight of everything they'd built, reputation, image, control, had finally collapsed in on itself. My mother tried to make eye contact. I didn't return it. Because by then I finally understood what Alina had known from the beginning: people like them don't change. They just wait for their turn to speak again. But our story? It had already ended. We moved to a smaller town after that. Quieter. No social circles to appease. No history to dodge. Just new air, new mornings, new peace. Grace thrived. She started writing short essays at first, then pieces that won contests. She didn't write about them. She didn't need to. They no longer existed in the story she was choosing to tell. And us? We finally stopped living in defense. We started living in clarity, in stillness, in the loud absence of toxicity. The final karmic blow didn't come from any courtroom or confrontation. It came quietly with a bounce in Grace's step, a laugh that returned without flinching, and a family photo we took on her 13th birthday, just the three of us. Smiling. Whole. Free. My parents lost access to the one thing they cared about most, the story they could no longer rewrite. And Grace? She didn't just walk away from the damage. She outgrew it.